we're going to move to Toolkits and Useware, which was the other major thing we did with the only full-time employer of this project, which is Lasse van den Dickenberg. He has done all the Flint work, but I will present his part of the paper because he has a paper this afternoon. It's all very much joint ventures. I think you already heard what useware analysis is. This is on Flint, these pictures. You see use retouch, you see polish, you see striations and rounding, and it's the combination of all these features that we really can observe, they're real, that leads us to interpret the function. It's actually one of the very, if not the only method, at the absence of organic materials, with which we can infer indirectly the use and the working of organic materials like hide, horn nowadays as well, and that relies, of course, very much on experiments. We do a lot of experiments and we observe the traces on these experimental tools and we compare them visually with the traces, with this combination of traces, the distribution, the use retouch, the whole gamut of traces that are possible with those on archaeological tools. And this works not only for flint, but it also works for bone and antler, for stone, for pottery to some extent, for metal and shell. It's a lot of fun because we have to do a lot of experiments, but it's also a lot of work. Here you see these analogies, so I cannot stress, it's one of my stokpaardjes, whatever that's in English, but to really stress that we identify really the presence of traces, but we interpret them. Like actually all archaeology is interpretation, so we're not different, but sometimes people think that way. Also, the role of ethnography in ethnohistory is really important to give us new ideas, also how to carry out experiments. That's a bit what we do. Somehow I got involved with a lot of different materials. That was because some were hardly ever looked at or overlooked a bit in the past. And with Hardingsveld, just about everything that was worked ended up on my desk. So I started to get interested in the relationships, both in how tools were made, but also how they were used between all these different materials. And we started to call it toolkits, but it is really this entire network of how each tool is part of a larger technological system. It becomes really interesting that way because you're not only looking at pottery or not only at flint, but you can involve all of these materials. I'm now going to read from the paper by Lasse. The flint material he did the past 5 years. He studied a lot of flint material from Den Haag, Steinhof 448, from Hekelingen 339, from Arie Koplaan, Trench 15, 253, from Vlaardingen, Trench 1769, and from Zandwerve, a site where we're not going to talk too much about. It was selected because it's lying very close to the sites up in North Holland, which were involved with the North Holland Treasure Chest project, where Lucie and I were both involved in. And it was always designated as so-called Vlaardingen. So we were interested how Vlaardingen that was and how this related. But we will not refer much to it today at all. This is the network graphs. Lasse's thesis has a lot of these wonderful graphs. And with the very thick bars is the indication that there's a lot of it. There's a lot of hide working, the link between Steinhof and hide in that at Steinhof. And there's also a lot at Zandwerve, but there it concerns very little. So quantitatively, it looks significant here. It may be, but it's a very small sample. We observe a clear focus on hide processing. And despite being interpreted as a permanent settlement with a subsistence strategy focused on domesticates, the flint tools did not reveal evidence for local cereal harvesting, at least the flint tools, despite the fact that emmer and barley were found. However, this does not mean that cereals were not harvested. There was a really interesting thesis by another student who was involved to some extent in the project, Mark-Philippe Hach, who did an extensive experimental program with sickles with organic materials, sickles with inserts of shell, and they work really, really well. He almost won the LUF Scriptieprize, he was second, so it's a very good thesis. It's also very important to realize that the absence of flint sickles doesn't mean that they have not harvested cereals. Harvesting on the flint was very much present, it was present at Vlaardingen, Arie Koplaan. Here you see some of these flakes with the polish from cereal harvesting. This came as a bit of a surprise because levees were generally seen as maybe not permanent settlements, and we generally associate cereal growing with permanent settlement. That's something that we can discuss this afternoon. The character of these sites is very much an issue. There are still different ways of interpreting the data. Bone working, on the contrast, was not so much at all present at Den Haag-Steinhof, but was very much present on especially Hekelingen, but also Vlaardingen. In the latter two sites, it concerns carving and sawing traces that could be related to the metapodium technique, which you see displayed here in the left-hand corner, a characteristic very much related to making awls and chisels from these bones, usually of red deer bone, because they're very nice and straight. That gives very distinctive waste material, like that little distal end there that you see being cut off at that little scheme. At Den Haag-Steinhof and Zandwerven, bone material was poorly preserved, and it was not clear whether the absence of production waste from the metapodium technique, like you see, like I just showed you, was related to an absence of the use of this technique or to poor preservation instead. However, use-wear analysis has now shown that this technique was definitely not practiced here, as tools with the characteristic traces from carver or sawing bone, which are very difficult to miss, are lacking. So there's certainly a difference. For the use of the metapodium technique, the Delta communities preferred red deer bones. At Zandwerven and Steinhof, bone tool production seems to be limited to ad hoc tools. If red deer bones were not present or scarce, the metapodium technique was apparently not practiced. It should be noted, however, that the metapodia from especially red and roe deer are very suitable for this technique because they are perfectly straight, very strong lengthwise, and the bones of other animals are less so. The most striking outcome of the analysis of the flint from Steinhof is the abundance, and really abundance, of hide working tools at the site. More than 65% of the used edges display traces from working hide. Such a clear focus on one specific activity is something you would expect on temporary extraction camps focused on the exploitation of a specific resource. In the case of Steinhof, it obviously concerns a permanent settlement. So, how to explain such a strong focus on one activity? It can be suggested that the inhabitants produced more hides or hide-related products than they needed. There was ample space for cattle to graze around the settlement, but good quality local flint was rare on the coastal barriers. Could this overproduction have been used to exchange for the high-quality import flint that they needed? Flint from Belgium and Limburg was found at the site. We can thus see the emergence of part-time craft specialization, in which the inhabitants of Steinhof began to specialize in certain crafts, with the overproduction intended for exchange. Although this is most clear for Steinhof, with the focus on hide working, it may also be applicable to the bone tools produced in quite a large quantity at the sites of Hekelingen 3 and Vlaardingen with the metapodium technique. So maybe there is something similar going on. The conclusions based on flint is there's little evidence for diversity of activities at the dunes. The diversity in activity patterns is more prominent at the levee sites. Maybe this is somewhat unexpected, but it's what we see, and I think there are also explanations for that, but we can discuss that. Metapodium technique seems to be related to deer hunting. Serial harvesting is well attested for on the levees, especially at Vlaardingen, which came as a bit as a surprise. And at Den Haag-Steinhof, part-time specialization we see, and hide working for exchange.
All the stone tool material analyzed was very fragmentary in nature, and the only complete tools larger than a bit of a pebble size were found at Zandwerven, which were pound polishing stones. When looking at the table on the top right, it becomes clear that serial processing was an important function of the ground stone tools at these sites. The table displays the number of actually used areas, which are, like the name suggests, the zones on the stone that have been used, which are the top, bottom, and sides. So if you look at it like a cube, you have 6 sides. At many of these sites, the stones would have been used for a very long time. Bottom current polish is present at 3 of the sites and are only missing at Hekelingen. Bottom current polish forms when the current, so the bottom stone for the serial processing, moves slightly over the materials such as leather that it rests upon, as well as the crushed cereal grains that have fallen off. This, in combination with the intense use of the current, such as at Vlaardingen-Arikoplaan, seen in the picture on the left, can argue for an important part of cereals in subsistence at these sites, as the percentages of cereal milling actually used areas show as well in the third slide. So besides cereal processing, other activities occurred as well, of course, craft activities. These can be seen in the grinding of bone, flint, and processing hide. Working of bone occurred to some extent at every site except Zandwerve, and this makes sense as the only bone tool found at Zandwerve was not made with the metapodium technique, which has been seen, as previously mentioned, at Vlaardingen and Hekelingen. The function of the stone tool in this process would be grinding the bone tools, such as an awl or the needle, to a point. Flint polish is scarce, but still present at 3 of the sites. This aligns well with the evidence of import of ground flint axes rather than local production, where the whetstone, such an example is on the bottom right, it would have been used in resharpening or repairing the axe if it was chipped. The presence of hide working traces is slightly out of the ordinary, as in the archaeology of the Netherlands, not many hide working traces on groundstone have been found from other periods. They are present but very scarce. Nevertheless, even if present and well developed, especially at Steinhof, there does seem to be quite a lack of a polish there, where the majority of flint tools was used for the hide scraping, but there's very little hide working going on with the groundstone, so we can see a good example of variation between tool use, where groundstone was not really considered a good tool to assist in processing hides in this case. Lastly, there's the category of plant. You can see that's the big bar on the right, which is the broadest category, and unfortunately, usually the interpretation cannot come any closer to species level other than grainy, greasy, or dry plant polish. Sometimes you can get close to hazelnuts, as on the very right, or wood, but it is quite difficult to find. But it may have been very well possible that much of the plant material was processed for subsistence goals. And then lastly, you have the implications of habitation and subsistence at the sites. I have 4 conclusions. Differences between the sites are not that large, especially with cereal, and Zandwerve is an outlier, but due to preservation issues, it's very hard to guarantee that the results are very accurate. More cereal polish was found than expected from a levy site at Hekelingen 3, but especially at Vlaardingen. Although local cultivation of cereal is a bit of a subject of debate, cereal was a significant factor in the use life of these stone tools, especially when considering the degree of wear and presence of bottom current polish. Thirdly, the largest range of craft activities is found at Hekelingen, with Steinhof as a close second. The landscape of these sites are very different, yet the activities are not that different as one might expect with the large differences within the landscape. And lastly, there is a very frequent use and reuse of all the sides of the stones. And combined with high fragmentation rates, it emphasizes that stones were not local, and it would have taken quite some effort to obtain the stones, so they would have been used to the point of exhaustion.
Cynthia Promataruna looked at the Vlaardingen-Arikoplaan, looked at 45 tools from bone and antler, and she also helped with Hekelingen, but I think I had to do that in a month. So that was really a quick action, and to get all that confusing bone tools, we'll hear more about the parts of bone tools in a minute. So the first slide, you see very big differences between Hekelingen and Vlaardingen. In Hekelingen, there's an extensive use of the awls and of the tools for plant working, whereas hide working is very limited. And because we both looked at these tools, we are pretty sure that we are looking at the same thing, that we're confident that it's real, at least from what we saw. Whereas at Vlaardingen, there is more hide working. In my idea, it's a relevant observation from how to interpret maybe these sites. Then there is some bark working, some woodworking, also at Hekelingen. To the right, you see some of these traces. The traces were sometimes very, very confusing, and you'll hear more about it in the paper after the coffee, because we also think that there was a lot of intentional polishing on plants of these tools, and the one to the left, the picture to the left-hand corner has that, and all these little pinpricks are indications of handling. So we can often see where there is an extensive handling of these tools. To the right is a little chisel from Vlaardingen with woodworking traces. So you see it's both processing of plants, some hide working and some woodworking. Well, as to the toolkit, at the left-hand corner in the top, you see a small awl of bone. which displays traces from working with grass. And it's also completely polished with equisatum. And it's made of the beta-podium technique, which is displayed in the bottom. And the flint tools from Hekelinge that had these kind of traces of carving and cutting bone, which you need to do this, to perform this technique and to make these awls, were also present. And last, Aaron and Annemiek found this interesting grinding tone tool from Hekelinge, also with traces from grinding and resharpening these bone tools. And the interesting thing about this is that it's severely shortened. This is a tool that has been used a long, long time and has been reground, and it became shorter. And it's something that, for example, traditional beehive makers, they also use a bone that is like 15, 20 centimeters long, and slowly it gets reduced to only a few centimeters. So bone is really soft, actually, and wears down very quickly. But we do see on quite a number from Hekelinge, we see a polish that looks very much like grass, and as if there's lots of little scratches. And so I interpreted that as being from coiled basketry. And that's the visualization that Kelvin made here to the right, a woman working on an awl with coiled basketry, and in the back of it, there's another person who is grinding, who's polishing a piece of bone on crumbled equisatum. So that's a toolkit. Then what came as a real surprise when I was looking through the big box of Hekelinge objects, where there was a considerable number of these metapodia ends, there were two with very strange traces who really looked different. They had wear traces, they were clearly worn. I think if the location of the wear traces, I think it was an ornament. And this ornament was probably a centerpiece, as is displayed here in this visualization by Kelvin. At the bottom you see this metapodium. And I think it is really interesting that it is a red deer metapodium because, for example, in the Doggerland project, red deer occurs again and again. It is an animal that has played a very important role also in the life, but also in the cosmology of late Mesolithic people in the whole North Sea basin. So this seems to be, in a way, a continuation. So it's not just a waste product that we don't have to look at and that's indicative of a special technique. But apparently it has significance. It has a special significance for these people in order to make an ornament that's really quite heavily worn. So I think it tells us a little bit about their mindset, about other things than just function and tools and making things. The conclusions based on the bone and antler and teeth, we have a few more perforated teeth from Hekelinge as well, so there's more teeth than one that we looked at. Well, Hekelinge 3 is predominantly plant processing versus in Vlaardingen it's a little bit more hide working, but you have to bear in mind that amounts of material that we looked at that had traces is very small. There's a wider range of craft activities in Hekelinge. Again, that is also due to the sample, I think. I cannot imagine that would have been different in Vlaardingen if we had seen more tools, because one problem we are struggling with is that especially for Vlaardingen, but we fear it's also applicable to Hekelinge, there's a lot of material we didn't see. And in Marleveld there is a huge amount of metapodium tools and awls and chisels displayed that we have not been able, and Erik and I looked through all the boxes in the Vlaardingen depot and they are not there. So we have seen probably a very small amount, and which is every time you look at very old material, this is really a problem, that some of the best pieces, we had it also in the North Holland Treasure Chest project, that the key pieces sometimes are missing because they're wherever, in all sorts of, I see you nodding, it's really a problem. Okay, so that's the wider range, and then the complex biographies. So in the next paper, some of these complex biographies of bone and antler will be presented. I already stressed the special significance of red deer. What is really interesting is indeed the interconnectedness again of all these materials. So with respect to the plant working tools, they are made by the metapodium techniques, they're resharpened, they're polished. But you have this interconnectivity also in other ways. From Steinhoff, there is this, to the bottom right picture, there is this tiny little borer that was used to drill pottery, and they are repair holes. What happened is that these axes that they use, and the axes are essential, flint and stone axes, they break. They get an end shock, they break, and they get stuck in their antler shafts or their wooden shafts. But the other half is a perfect core to recycle into a lot of different flakes. That will also be discussed in the next paper a bit. These flakes can be turned into little awls. The awls can be made to drill these perforations through which, and that's the top right-hand corner, the bark, or in any case the plant fibers, are wound to bind the shirt, the broken off shirt, back into place. And you see at the bottom of the visualization, you see such a pot with the bindings. And in the top you see the bindings, the bark bindings hanging over. So here you see all these different materials that are connected basically in a way that if you only look at one thing, you don't really get the full picture. And this is again only a little part of such a larger system of relationships.